sat down. No animosity here, a lot of mutual respect, of course, but d4 and Magnus thinking. Let's play his knight out to f6, his trademark move, and bishop to g5 for Trompowsky. Just as Nakamura was displaying yesterday, he ventured this on several turns. Magnus must have prepared.
What's so interesting about this is the openings that Hikaru have been playing, they're usually for surprise value, but when you play them over and over again, there's no longer the surprise.
Yeah, shows his faith, shows his confidence in these openings, and Magnus does play something slightly unorthodox there. Usually in that exact position, black recaptures with the g-pawn towards the center. I think usually in chess, the default setting is towards the center, unless you're kind of aiming to open up pieces, trying to accelerate your development. Now black's d5 pawn is going to be eternally a target, so Magnus has to compensate with active pieces, and I must say, bizarre that Magnus is the first one to really think, especially, as you say, Robert, that this is no longer a surprise weapon from Hikaru.
And Magnus just made the big choice. He is the one who captured away from the center. This kind of resembles some lines in the Dutch defense. He does defend that d5 pawn. His knight on b8 can develop next. The dark square bishop is already protecting the c5 pawn. And perhaps Magnus wanted to avoid the territory that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave got himself into, because Hikaru showed he has very deep preparation to some of these lines.
And Hikaru had some deep preparation in game one of this match, as well as Magnus himself admitted that he was taken by surprise and felt the pressure. Can Hikaru continue with that? He takes out the knight in front of the king. It will eventually land on f4, trying to put more pressure on that d5 pawn. The development continues. Are we expecting white's knight to land on f4?
Quite possibly, if not now, then in the near future. First, he might decide to fianchetto his bishop. White's light squared bishop is stuck. There we go, he pushes the pawn, creating a nice, beautiful home for it on the g2 square. Again, peering at that weakness, the target, the d5 pawn for black. And Hikaru, if he gets two more moves, if he gets his bishop there on g2, gets castled, I think he's going to be loving his position long-term. Strategically, very strong for white. Better pawn structure and targets, especially if the center's closed, knights will thrive rather than bishops. So Magnus needs to play energetically and creatively here to hold the balance.
And once again, it is Magnus who goes into a bit of a think in this position. How can he try to play energetically in this position? Does he start attacking Hikaru's center, take out the queen to b6, target the b2 pawn, not give white enough time and tempo to put pressure on the d5 pawn?
I can tell you what I wouldn't do if I were Magnus. I wouldn't close the center by pushing the c5 pawn, because that feels like it leaves the d5 pawn as a long-term weakness. He starts by taking on d4. That makes a lot of sense to me. It opens up his bishop on f8, gives it full scope of the diagonal, maybe out to b4 to pin that knight. His queen can go out to b6. That's one of the benefits of pushing your c-pawn so early in a Sicilian or in this type of game. The queen can venture out, putting pressure on b2 and the white central pawn on d4. So I like the way that both players are handling it thus far. I think it's early stages, but for Hikaru, he's the one now taking a think here. Clearly both players are on their own.
Yeah, if he takes with the knight, it does look nice for white long term against this pawn. Magnus says, okay, take me if you dare, pawn to d4, and this relies on the fact that after an exchange, suddenly white is again caught in two minds. Suddenly this bishop hits the a pawn, suddenly black's rook is unleashed against the backward c2 pawn, and if you take with the queen, again, a skewer, a double attack, whatever you call it, disaster for white. This diagonal is just too vulnerable, and I think this would be disastrous. Suddenly the bishop's really dominating the whole board. So the question is, can you take with the knight? That's one I haven't figured out yet. I think that's one Hikaru's trying to figure out in the current position. Can he take twice? Feels like Magnus has something in mind here. This looks so dangerous with the pin. Maybe you move your bishop to attack this knight, and it's just hanging by a thread right now for Hikaru.
With the bishop pair, seeing all the files on diagonal open up, one gets the feeling that d4 might have been also an intuitive sacrifice, rather than Magnus having calculated all the lines and how he's going to win the pawn back or take advantage of it. It's really so tempting, and you have a feeling that with the bishops and the rooks lined up, something has to work for black here.
Yeah, for sure. All the pieces are on optimal squares, and even if white can grab the pawn on d4, the worst thing that happens for black is you grab the a3 pawn. So you're like, oh, it's just this pawn trade. That's not a big deal. I didn't blunder anything. So that's the good news for Magnus. As you said, Tanya, it might be an intuition, the decision there. Like, let me just go for it. At the very least, on equal material, but he may even have more.
Yeah, I'm looking at ideas like bishop t5, maybe bishop to g4, kick away this rook before taking back on this square. But Hikaru goes for it. He's maybe obliged to go for this, otherwise he's just suffering for nothing. Often in chess, if you're worse, if you realize you have a disadvantage, you might as well grab some material, you might as well get some long-term advantages and hope to survive, suffer for a reason. But right now it's up to Magnus Carlsen. I'll let him make the decision rather than myself, because it's calculation time. He needs to justify this sacrifice. If he takes that pawn, as you mentioned, Robert, on a3, he's probably still slightly better, but he might be looking for more, first of all.
So many options here for black. That can be difficult for a player in that it can backfire. You're like, oh, I have so many options, my position is great, but then you burn clock trying to figure out the best path forward. I liked this move, bishop e5 or bishop c5 to induce c3. That's an option. I'm wondering in those lines, can black also go after the b3 pawn, but there are pins galore. It's not easy to calculate, so Magnus is investing time wisely.
And as Magnus does just that, trying to figure out the way forward after giving up that pawn, we will check in with this game. Meanwhile, action is really heating up as Alireza Firouzja has sacrificed an exchange for, once again, to get that attack and initiative against Wesley. So we are going to jump into that as it is